So now that we learned about outputting conditional content, it's time to continue with this app, and here with that questions screen, which of course is far from being finished here. So for that, back in code, in this questions screen file here, in the questions screen Dart file, where we have this questions screen widget, the goal now in the end is to output a question and then a couple of possible answers for this question, where only one answer will be right. And after the user chose an answer, that answer must be stored somewhere so that it can be considered for deriving the final results screen. But immediately after picking an answer, the next question in line should be shown with its answers until there are no more questions and answers left. That's the goal here. So therefore, we need two main things here. We need some widgets here to display the question and the answers, but we also need the questions. And I will start with that. For that, in the lib folder, I actually want to add a new code file because I want to define a class that acts as a blueprint for my question objects. Because I want to set up questions as objects that group the question and the possible answers together into one data structure. Because that's what objects are about in the end, as you learned. They are about grouping related data and logic together. And even though we only used classes to build custom widgets up to this point, we can also use this class feature to create blueprints for all other kinds of objects, like for example these question data structures with which I want to work. That's why I'll add a new code file, and I will actually add that file in a subfolder in that lib folder. So I'll add a new folder in this lib folder, which you can of course also do by using this menu here and then picking new folder. And I'll name that folder models because I want to store my data models in there, the blueprints for the data I'm working with. And in this models folder, in the lib folder, I'll add my quiz_question.dart file. And this is now not a file that will contain a widget, but instead a file that will contain my question blueprint. For that, I'll still use the class keyword because we of course still need to create a class here. And I'll name this class quizQuestion, though that name is up to you. And this will now not extend anything because it will not be a widget and there is nothing else that this class would need to extend. Instead, it's just defined like this. And in this class, you can now define which kind of data you want to store and which kind of additional logic you might want to put in there. And here, for a start, I'll add two final class variables, instance variables, so two properties that should exist on these quiz question objects later. And the first one is the actual question text, which should be of type string, defined like this. And then, as mentioned, I want to have a couple of possible answers, so a collection of answers. And for that, I'll add an answers property, but what could now be the type of that? Well, in the end, it should be a list of answers, a list of strings. And therefore, the proper type here is list, and then a list of strings, utilizing this generic list type, which I did show you a couple of times before in this course already. So that's my answers property. And now in order to set these properties to some values, we also need a constructor function so that we can reuse this class and create different quiz question objects with different texts and different answers based on the same blueprint. Therefore here, just as for our widgets, we add a constructor function that can receive some arguments, which are then mapped to these properties. And for that, I expect to get my text, which is then mapped to this text property by using this text. And as a second argument here in this constructor function, I expect to get my answers list. And here we can now add const, because indeed, once such an object is created in the future, it will not be changed thereafter. At least right now, there is no way of changing this. Hence, we can also allow the creation of const quiz questions. And we do allow this by adding const in front of the constructor function. With that, we got this quiz question class. And now we can add another file, which I'll add in another subfolder in the lib folder, which I'll name data, where I want to store my actual dummy questions, which I want to use for this quiz here. And hence I'll name this file questions.dart. The name is up to you, but in here I now want to define all these questions. And the idea here is to create a questions variable, or even a constant, since I don't plan on changing that list of questions as part of this application, which could be named questions. And that should then be a list of such question objects that are created with help of this quiz questions class on which we just worked. For that, in this questions.dart file, we have to import this model file on which we just worked from our project, and they are from models, this quiz question.dart file. And then here in this questions list, we can create our quiz questions by simply calling the constructor function and then passing the question text here as a first argument. For example, what are the main building blocks of Flutter UIs? Like this, that could be my question. And then as a second argument to quiz question, we pass a list of answers, a list of answer strings. Because quiz question is defined such that we want to get a list of strings as a second argument. And that list of strings will then be mapped to this answers property, as defined in our class. And here we could then have widgets as the first possible answer, components as the second possible answer, blocks as the third possible answer, and functions as the fourth possible answer. And my goal here is to make sure that it's always the first answer that is correct, because we'll need to know which answer was correct for showing an appropriate results screen later, where we inform the user which answer would have been correct and which answer was chosen by the user. And to make sure that we later know which answer was correct, I'll make sure that it's always the first answer in this list of answers that is the correct one. And to make sure that our quiz doesn't become predictable, we'll shuffle these answers before displaying them on the screen. But internally, the correct answer will always be the first one in this list of answers. Well, and now you find a questions.dart file attached, which you should use to replace your file with, because this file, which you find attached, then contains a bunch of example questions, a bunch of dummy questions, which we can use for this demo app here. And I'm providing this file so that you don't have to come up with all these questions and answers and write all these questions and answers on your own. The attached file assumes that we have a quiz question model as defined in this quiz question.dart file. So in order to use these attached questions, you must make sure that your quiz question model looks exactly like mine. So it must have the same name and the same properties. And with that, we got the questions for our app. Now it's time to use them on this questions screen.